I guess I'm the perfect follow-up in that I come from Placer County, given his presentation. I want to bring you local government's perspective. So we have a very different relationship in terms of the engagement of policy and science, and I think many do, because of much of what we do involves decision-making around land use on private property and then the provision of services to those people who live and work in our communities. Placer County is located in the Sierra Nevadas for the most part. We are on the east and west slopes between Lake Tahoe and the Nevada border on the east side, and we extend down to the valley floor just east of Sacramento, so we actually get down to about 200 feet in elevation on the valley floor. As a result, it is a very biologically diverse place. I went through the state of California's wildlife habitat relationship mapping and looked at the various community types, and what you find is 71% of all community types found in the WHR system are found in Placer County. We miss the desert, we miss the marine systems, but you can find everything else. So we're a very biodiverse place, and obviously the state of California and its own biodiversity. The conservation story doesn't necessarily match up with that biodiversity. The Sierra Nevadas is reasonably well protected in Placer County, primarily through the Tahoe and El Dorado National Forests, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management. The western portion of the county, below 1,500 feet in elevation for the most part, is not protected. It is virtually all private property. There have been activities of land trusts, mitigation banks, but for the most part it is land put to private purposes, including the potential for significant growth. When we look at the next 50 years, with our economic forecasting, we will see a doubling in the population of Placer County from around 350 to around 700,000 persons around 2060. Virtually all of that growth, if you know the county, will happen below Auburn, west of Roseville, west of Rockland, really in the Central Valley, in the grasslands of western Placer. That's about 45,000 acres of land, given the forecast that we have, and the form and type of growth that we are projecting for that area, which includes about 10,000 acres of vertical grassland. So it is an area that has rare and endemic species. It is a conversion of those places. We also have a lot of rural residential fragmentation that's been going on in the county really since the gold rush era. So when you look at policy and you look at science and you find this imperfect marriage at the local government level, it is a real challenge to bring the two together. Principles of science pretty much stand for themselves, they're universally accepted. When you look at sort of principles of local government decision making, it's a lot different. When we bring forward a decision for our elected officials to make, we as staff bring forward objective data, some of which is science derived. But the electeds also want to know how somebody feels about a project. How do they relate to it inside their community? So subjective information is just as relevant and oftentimes more compelling than actual objective data. And the bottom line in our case is it's 3 votes on a Tuesday afternoon is a decision, and it will be implemented regardless how you got there. You also find, in this case, one very particular example that actually relates to Placer County. Policymakers at the local government elected level don't necessarily have to rely upon science to make policy decisions. So in the mid-1990s, we had a very large project proposed adjacent to our sanitary landfill. There was a long multi-year debate as to whether or not that was an appropriate use. A lot of information was shared, some of which very subjective. A decision was made, we were sued. The Court of Appeals found, while no scientific evidence was introduced to support this 1-mile buffer for non-residential, so other uses could be allowed, other substantial and relevant evidence supports the county's decision. This restriction has a reasonable relation to the public welfare and is a valid exercise of the county's police power. It was good policy, not necessarily grounded in science. When you bring it forward to individual planners doing the day-to-day activity of reviewing use permits and parcel maps and variances and all the things that they do, they rely upon policy. That policy was hopefully grounded in science, but not necessarily always. They're not necessarily focused on those principles of science as they're bringing their information forward. They're reviewing policy, they're reviewing standards, they're reviewing ordinances, they're taking public input, and they're getting all that subjective information as well and bringing that forward. What you have when science is brought to that dialogue, which could be at the very end of a process. We have a specific plan in Placer County that was conceived in the mid-1980s. It was approved by our Board of Supervisors just last week. 30+ years of dialogue around that particular project. When science is introduced at the end of that process, from an elected official's perspective, there's often a negative reaction. You're trying to delay, you're trying to avoid, you're trying to keep something from happening that we as policymakers want to move forward as an initiative. California Environmental Quality Act oftentimes is the vehicle through which objective data is brought into the discussion. We need information, we need to disclose that information, we need objective facts to decide how we can avoid environmental effects or mitigate those environmental effects. But at the same time, CEQA doesn't take you to the point of research. And what you find is CEQA is unfortunately a tool that is often used to achieve results not necessarily associated with its essential purpose of informing, disclosing, and providing information to decision makers on how to reduce or eliminate environmental effects. I have sat through CEQA litigation negotiations with parties that involve, we want a swimming pool for our community, or we want a labor contract, or we don't like what this thing looks like, we want it to look different. Not necessarily anything related to the environmental effects of the project, so CEQA becomes a tool for a different purpose. While that is certainly within the due process rights of everybody involved in the arguments and debates that occur around land use, the unfortunate part is how the elected officials react to it. They see it as a reason to use CEQA other than its intended purposes, so very often you get a very negative reaction to it. There are places where policy and science do routinely interact, not necessarily always happening at the local government level. If I go in for a Section 7 consultation on a Federal Endangered Species Act incidental take permit, we're going to be involving as much science as possible. When we come into what we do at the local government level, where policy is best informed by science is in long-range and advanced planning activities, and that policy implication has decades worth of effect. So you do it early, you do it often at that policy level and not necessarily at the project level. So 3 examples in Placer County where we're doing this. One is our Placer Legacy program, which is a non-regulatory open space program. It's the preparation of a habitat conservation plan, natural communities conservation plan, known as the Placer County Conservation Plan, and working on a revised tree ordinance. So Placer Legacy is a program been around since 2000. It implements the goals and policies, the open space and conservation goals and policies of our general plan, something every county and city government in the state of California has to do. But through that program, we've been able to engage science through 5 initiatives, really 4 out of the 5. One is the preparation of this Placer County Conservation Plan that emerged out of Placer Legacy. 2, to shut off political boundaries and start to look at things at the watershed level in terms of ecosystem function. Outreach and education, that has elements of science attached to it. And then acquisition of properties. And the acquisitions that we put forward are very much based on ecological decision making, but also other objectives of the program, which might be scenic or historic or outdoor education. When you go back and look at that program, which was a 2-year collaborative effort, it started with a science advisory panel. The very first thing we did was convene a science advisory panel. They established principles for open space conservation in Placer County that we should carry out, and we have stuck to that over the years. We have engaged scientists and elements of the academic community throughout. We just 2 days ago had a delegation from South Korea who came to Placer County wanting to know how we are dealing with woodland effects with new growth, both urban and rural residential. Focusing again on watershed level as opposed to political boundaries, ecosystem function instead of whether it's a city or a county that manages that area. Monitoring, very much a part of our process. We've had good success, not as much success as we would like because it's a program that's difficult to fund, but nevertheless around 10,000 acres has come into conservation. One of the best examples is the Hidden Falls Regional Park, 1,200 acres in size. It was purchased for outdoor recreational purposes, but it provides large patch of blue oak woodland, connectivity within a roadless area in the Coon Creek watershed that will extend from the valley floor to the Sierra Nevada, reduces negative edges, reduces fragmentation. It does a variety of things from a science-based standpoint that we are able to inform our electeds for its primary purpose, which was to get a place for our community to recreate, close to an urban place, but very wild. Hidden Falls is also part of a very large effort, not just locally here in Placer County, but throughout the Sierra Nevada, to try to connect the valley floor through the foothills into the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. We're part of the Spencerville Conceptual Area Protection Plan. We work with Placer Land Trust, Nevada County Land Trust, in a variety of organizations, not just to achieve our own local goals through Placer Legacy, but to achieve some broader initiatives and objectives as well. One third example under the Placer Legacy program is Fish Passage. We, through work that was funded by CalFed in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we were able to prioritize a couple of watersheds for conservation. We knew of the presence of salmon and steelhead because of work we had been doing in the field. We knew which projects were a priority, and we knew what would happen if we could actually get these fish passage impediments removed. It took years to go from policy, protect our streams, to programs, Placer Legacy, to funding out of the propositions, to putting something on the ground, but it worked. This worked. Chinook salmon are further up into this watershed than they have been probably in 50 or even 100 years. The second example is the Placer County Conservation Plan. It is a traditional HCP and NCCP. It's balancing that 45,000 acres of growth with conservation. It's primarily in western Placer County. We're looking at incidental take authorization, State and Federal Endangered Species Act, and we're also weaving in Clean Water Act. It's not an independent part of the program, which often happens with HCPs and NCCPs. It's embedded in our program. We're essentially looking at a landscape of conservation, the area in green, building on existing conservation, the area in dark green, areas of growth in pale yellow. 45,000 acres of conversion will happen over multiple years. It's in that conservation footprint that we will be able to apply the principles of science in terms of the lands that get acquired, how we restore those lands, and how we will be able to manage them in perpetuity. HCPs and Science have a long history. Most of it's pretty good in terms of comparing it to, say, how I review a tentative map or a use permit, but there's also criticisms. There's a lot of things we don't know about these species, yet you're making decisions forever that will affect them. You're allowing for incidental take. There's a lack of existing research, there's a lack of access to private property, there's a heavy reliance upon remote sensing tools, as well as modeling to make these decisions. Nevertheless, compared to project-by-project review, we believe that a plan that is implemented with a common understanding of the agencies, with science that is applied to that decision, is better than status quo, which is individual projects. And then lastly, the county is looking at oak woodlands, largely in response to some changes in CEQA about 10 years ago with Senate Bill 1334. That bill basically said, stop looking at oak trees and start to look at oak woodlands. It only applied to county government. We convened science advisors again. We worked with Dr. Richard Harris, who at the time was at UC Berkeley Extension. He's now under contract with us on a routine basis. And we started to focus on landscape scale effects, stand level effects, and individual tree effects, but not doing what we would traditionally do, which is measure inches of trees that somebody cut as is the basis for which you develop a mitigation program. Placer County has, I think, a pretty typical history of loss of trees, just like Izzy was talking about in Nevada County, around Nevada City. The picture on the left is mid-1930s. There's probably not an oak tree standing. Every little dot on that map is an orchard tree. You roll the clock forward into where we're at today. It's rural residential with oak tree regeneration, but woodland function is largely gone. So what we are looking at is conserving in this area that same Coon Creek watershed where Hidden Falls is, the same one where Wildlife Conservation Board says the state of California should prioritize acquisitions in favor of trying to mitigate on-site, in-kind, with inches of replacement, what we would typically do if we go back to the traditional way of just adding up inches of loss and replanting inches of loss. So we're largely going to be a fee-based program. We will collect fee revenues. We will spend money conserving land as the primary motivation and restoring land and not necessarily compensating for a loss at a no net loss level. So conservation and restoration as opposed to on-site in-kind replacement. When you get into individual trees, we will go back to status quo. Under 2 acres, we're essentially saying it's not a forest, it's a tree, mitigate accordingly, which is individual tree replacement. Everything gets nested within the understanding, though, of what's happening at the landscape. It's at the landscape where science has informed the process, that we know where we're going to go in perpetuity in terms of our stewardship, our monitoring, our management, our restoration of those resources. In the past, it was a tree, you cut it, you replaced it, you monitored it for 5 years, and you left it to a homeowners association. We're turning that on its head, not just for Oaks, but for all of the major communities in western Placer County. So in closing, the pitch is work with local government. Local government needs science to inform its policy decisions. General plan work, conservation plan work, those long-range advanced planning programs are the best place. Be flexible, be engaged. Local government's going to change hats every 2 years. Electeds come and go very frequently, so you need to stay engaged. You need to understand who the staff is, how they work, the things they do, and there's good success that can come from it. Thank you very much.